Hello, Saigon Green. Don't dare to include Americans, Canadians, Australians in the whites category. I honestly don't know why you are being so anti-non-Europeans. After all, they are of European descent. So and apparently you're not. So I really can't understand your strangely convoluted attitude towards whites of a certain continent and whites of another continent. Hello, Roy. My name is Claire. You don't have to call me the hardcore prawn. I have a main channel, the Clairecore channel. It's got a strike on the 1st of May, so it won't expire until the 14th or after. Yes, Jay wants to be let on, but what has he to say? But I want to talk about white identity. I'll probably go all over the place. And I mentioned Christianity, that goes with white identity, and a lot of you kind of think that. Some of you have come to the conclusion, as I have, that Christianity is kaput. And some of you deny that, or like Jay, you can't make up your mind if it is or isn't, and you hope it isn't, and you hope it doesn't matter. But I'm telling you again and again that it does matter. And you can tell that it does simply because the people you're always complaining about, Jews and Muslims, have their religious identity. And this in itself should give you a clue as to where they are and where you are. And very frustratingly, I can't get anyone to respond to the main point that I am trying to make. I've put out a few tentacles to the Jews and Muslims, but guess what? They're afraid of you guys. So it's like, don't be afraid of them. They're stupid. They're weak. They can't even deal with some obvious fact without getting triggered and going crazy. Why not? Tell them the truth. Suck it to them. And as for any danger you think you might face, surely it was not as great as the kind of violence and intimidation you face from their ancestors when they would burn heretics. I mean, it's not Jews and Muslims they would be mean to. They would burn their own people. Christians would burn other Christians as heretics, and these idiots in the chat at the moment, they don't even know. They don't even know their own history. So, talking to these people is like talking to somebody who's, got a drink or drug problem. So maybe last night you had a word with them and they even agreed with you after appearing to understand what you said. But when they wake up this morning, they will have no memory. So when you say, do you remember last night when you said blah, 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 they'll have no memory. So it's like playing a very frustrating computer game when, you've got past level 1, you've got past level 2, but obviously you don't have the stamina to go all the way to the end of the game in one session. So you stop the game, but when you stop the game, it just goes back to the beginning and you have to start all over again. And when they are always, always like that, you do begin to wonder. So Jay's always wanting to come on, but he has nothing new to say. And his idea of winning the game is appearing on my channel and talking shit. Whatever I said that he finds objectionable, he can always post it in the comments below. But he actually has no argument, so there's no point in him posting anything, because all he wants is the chance to hear his own voice. It's the same with Jen, really. It's the same with all these people who said, yeah, we'll talk to you. Oh, we're not going to talk to you after all because a boycott has been declared on you. Like the boycott in the liberal media. So what is wrong with white people? Well, I'm saying it's obvious to me. Since they're always complaining about Jews and Muslims, it's pretty obvious now what the problem is. Christianity. Because if Christianity were doing its job, then they wouldn't be worrying about Jews subverting their society as they claim, or Muslims invading them as they're always complaining about. They would have solved the problem already. So the problem is Christianity. But then the problem is that they don't believe in God, and that means that they're nihilists, and that means that the only thing that they worship is their emotions and their stupid views that they can't face being challenged on. It's certainly not truth, logic and morality that they submit to. It is always the immediacy of their emotions caused by their reason not working, caused by them not exercising reason, caused by them ignoring facts or simply not knowing about things, and then when you tell them, they pretend not to understand you. And this is their behaviour ever since I took an interest in politics. I mean, to be fair, are other people of other religions any better? Well, possibly not. Possibly not. But what I wonder is why. I mean, can it really be true that there isn't anyone in charge, anyone sensible, anyone capable of taking this upwards? But there doesn't seem to be. So again, it is further evidence that the political system is malfunctioning or not even functioning at all. So why does Jay want to come on? He has nothing to say. So obviously hearing the sound of his own voice gives him enormous comfort. Then he'll talk the same old shit, and then and then everybody will cheer him on because they like hearing the same old shit. And then it's like, okay, that's enough for today. I've done what I wanted. I've heard myself saying the same old shit like it was a mantra, and that will have to do for the day. For maybe tomorrow I die, but sufficient unto the day, right? Now, it's not just Jay who doesn't know what he's talking about. I half listened to Richard Spencer and Keith Woods going on about Israel and the Palestinians, and it's just more crap. We all know they don't care about what happens in Israel. They know they have to pretend to care and pretend to have a view, and nothing will work. I actually have the solution, but I think they're all they've all agreed not to hear it, or if they hear it and understand it even for one split second, they will push it out of their mind, spit it out as if it were poison, and then go around in their state of blankness and talk about the same old shit they always talk about, like, oh, the Jews are to blame, but they did terrible things to the Palestinian, but we hate Muslims, but we have to pretend to care about the Palestinians because somehow that will give us our ethno-state, which doesn't make sense, but they don't care. So I guess what, people who listen to that very forgettable channel name where Richard Spencer and Keith Woods always appear on, they just go to hear the sound of their voices, because just hearing their voices is presumably very comforting to these white nationalists. So why do you guys come here anyway? You don't like what I say, but for some reason you do come back. So I guess you regard this as an opportunity to post your anti-Semitic views and your abuse. I can call. Good morning, citizen reporter. Nothing sensible, all insults. You see, if Jay had anything to say, he'd be able to post it in 200 characters. He would be able to write. But, it's like 200 characters. It's not very long. He can do that. But he won't. Because there's nothing he can say that he can... There's nothing he can say that could be reduced into a sentence that is convincing, which is why he won't do it. He won't use Ask FM because you will know, if he did answer my questions, how ridiculous they are. But I did have a few things to say. Actually, I put it in the list. So I've mentioned Richard Spencer and Keith Woods talking about the Palestinian question as if anybody cared what they thought, and then I don't know what convoluted reason they gave for if anybody adopts our solution to the Palestinian question, we, white nationalists, will get our ethno-state. It's just such crap. Why do you even bother with... I didn't even finish it. What streams should do is basically... okay, they should be able to just describe what they're saying in the title, right? So I'm basically saying that you won't have any kind of identity if you don't have an effective religion, and you won't have an effective religion if you continue with Christianity because you don't believe in it, because it's so absurd and unbelievable that you can't bring yourselves to believe in it, and therefore you reject your Christian identity, and you haven't acknowledged that you need some other identity to replace, some other religious identity to replace the one that you have neglected and rejected for decades, if not centuries. So it's not enough to be white and speaking the same language, because we already know what the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant did to each other. Forget what they did to other people. Just look at what they did to each other as Christians. So obviously it isn't working, so things sort of became a little bit enlightened during the Enlightenment, and then they just threw themselves over the cliff of extremism when they when the ideas of the French Revolution got to America. So I guess really the West has been in a state of flux for quite a long time now, and I think the solution is very simple. If you want a stable family life, if you want a stable economy, if you want people who know what they're doing in charge again, the answer is very simple, but you can't face it. Why can't you face it? You can't face admitting that Christianity is kaput. But then, it's obviously kaput if you don't believe in it. And you don't, do you? So it makes no sense at all, and you're all as mad as a certain person whose name I won't mention. So even as you complain about a certain tribe, you are implicitly acknowledging the superiority of their religion. So Hitler, who was white and Christian, who summoned the collective force of Germany to kill and kick out Jews, he couldn't do it. And it wasn't just Hitler who did it to them, it was, well, all the other now extinct empires who tried to do it to them, and they're still around. So you might as well accept the narrative, because in a way you do. Even by complaining about Jews, you are accepting the narrative. You're saying, bad thing happened, it must be the Jews. So you're using Jews to explain everything, and you seem to like that particular narrative that you have. So what you could do is just go for the whole thing, the total Abrahamic narrative. And obviously, there's this Abrahamic God. I think even if you know nothing about the New Testament, have never read it, never entered a church, you're vaguely aware of the Ten Commandments that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai by God himself, and then out of that came the Old Testament, and then Jesus kind of branched out and did his thing in his New Testament, and the market was Gentiles. So Christianity became successful amongst Gentiles because the bargain was so simple. Because basically it said, to be Christian, all you have to do is claim you believe that Christ is also God, and then you're one of us. And when you're one of us, we won't persecute you, we won't victimize you, we won't inquisition you, and we won't crusade you, so you'll be all right. But we might occasionally burn you as a heretic if you, as a Christian, say the wrong thing. So obviously under this system, a lot of people would just keep quiet. Why be burnt as a heretic when just by shutting up you don't? Unless you're somebody like John Wycliffe, who was the arch Lollard. And basically the Lollards were the beginnings of non-denominationalism. So that there was a lot of toing and froing in England about who was in charge, Catholics or Anglicans, and Anglicanism, John Wycliffe thought, was too copycatting of Catholicism and all the bad things about Catholicism, and he had 12 conclusions, which I've been studying in the last 2 days, and you know, it highlights what he thought was wrong with both the Catholic and the Anglican Church, and he managed to die a natural death on the 28th of December, when he died of a stroke during prayers in church. But mean things were done to him after he was dead. They disinterred him and did horrible things to his corpse, as was the wont of people in those times, you know, because he was judged to be a heretic. So I think white people should know that white people can be very nasty to each other. You know, even before the blacks and the Asians and the Muslims arrived. So I think you're kind of getting it now, because even as you complain, it's like, oh, those Muslims, those Jews, you're really saying these groups of people that you're complaining about, they have a religion and you don't. They're stronger or higher status or protected because of their religion and their race, and you are not, and your own government hates you. What's going on? And I'm saying, it is a problem of religion. What's your solution? Your solution seems not to be talking about it at all. I've tried asking nationalists a few questions, like, what do you think religion is for? And they don't even want to engage. So, when you finally get it, you will see that the narrative, the Abrahamic narrative, is very simple. You know, God created the world and humanity, and he divided humanity between Jew and Gentile. It's very simple, very simple. So if you're not Jewish, you're a Gentile. So what's the point of Jews, you might ask? And then Jews will say, well, we are the chosen people of God. That's what it says in the Tanakh, actually, the Old Testament. So we could ask them, well, what did God choose you to do? And then they'd have to say something about being light unto nations, and because we're so clever, and we've got all the important ideas, like the Abrahamic God, like the rule of law. We thought of it first. And since Christianity and Islam are derived from Judaism, you can thank Christianity and Islam for... You can thank Judaism for Christianity and Islam. And if you Christians and you Muslims tortured us because we weren't Christians or Muslims like you, then we have, not only did we give you the foundation for your religion, we also paid the price when you tortured us after you became bigger and more than us. And now what seems to be the problem? And of course it's a failure of Christianity, and you won't accept it, or you won't do anything about it. And of course my problem is that nobody will discuss it with me. No one. Good to see you again, Alex. You at least post sensible comments. So Dr. Mengele always asks these questions like, why were Jews expelled from 109 countries? Because they practice usury. And Jews are told in their book to declare a jubilee every 7 years, which is to release slaves and forgive debt. But they didn't. And when the Gentiles to whom they lent money realised that they would never be able to pay off their debt, they kicked the Jews out. So you would have thought these clever Jews would know what to do, right? It's like, well, if we don't want to be kicked out, we have to go back to the old rules of declaring a jubilee. But then, in a way, that the problem was solved for them, because instead of Jews practicing usury, Christians did, thanks to John Calvin, who said, well, there's nothing in the New Testament that says we can't practice usury, is there? But he would have noticed that there was something in the Quran, chapter 2, verse 275, that forbids usury. But then he could say, well, we're not Muslim, and the Muslims have been mean to us with the really annoying Ottoman Empire trying to encroach on European territories, so we don't like them, and we can't have the religion of our enemies because it would be admitting defeat to them. So that never happened. And then, of course, you had the wars of the Reformation, and then the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and the European Wars of Unification, and the Napoleonic Wars, and the... And then finally the War of German Unification, which made Britain very nervous, which really was the real reason why Britain declared war on Germany in 2 world wars. So I'm saying you wouldn't have needed a war the Reformation wouldn't have been necessary at all if he'd already been Muslim. The English Reformation would not have been necessary at all if Henry had been Muslim, because we know that he wanted to break from Rome because the Pope said, no, you can't divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry someone. She did no wrong. And the Pope, won't annul your marriage for you. And Henry said, the fuck with that. I'm not going to leave my kingdom without a male heir. But if he had been Muslim, you see, his son, Edward, was the son of his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. So it would have been well within the rules of Islam, which allows you to have up to 4 wives. So Henry could have, said, well, I hope you don't mind, Catherine, but I do need a male heir, and we already know that at your age you're not going to be about to give me a healthy son after all your miscarriages. And she would have understood and said, well, all right then, you can marry Anne Boleyn. And then Anne Boleyn didn't manage to give him a son, and he got very upset, and I guess she was a bit manipulative and controlling, and he got tired of her and had her beheaded. But Jane Seymour was all right. He did love her, and she did give him a son. Unfortunately, she died after childbirth, very soon after childbirth. So that was no good. But I know you can't take the historical perspective about these things. You're going to just sort of sit there and say, what's that got to do with us? Right? That's how you all think, and you think, Well, if you accepted the Abrahamic narrative of God, the narrative of the Abrahamic God, in that he created us and everything happens for a reason. See, one of the things about Judaism is that I know you wouldn't, I can't expect you to know this, but Jews are actually expected to thank God for their misfortunes. Now that is surprising, isn't it? Well, I know quite a few of them find it difficult to do that because we know the story of Job, whom God tested, basically. So the story started with God and Satan having a conversation, and God said, "Look, Job's such, a great guy, and I've rewarded him with wealth and children, and he's got a bit of an annoying wife, but well, he is the envy of his community." And Satan basically said, "Well, of course he'll approve of you. You gave him all these nice things of his life. If you take them away, he'll curse you." So that was a bet between God and Satan. Well, you know the story in the end. But one of the amusing things that his slightly annoying wife said, Job's annoying wife said, was when she said to him, "Look at what your God has done to you. Look at you with your boils, with your rags, your boils and scars and skin disease bleeding into your rags. You might as well curse God and die." Anyway, he didn't. And in the end, his fortunes were restored, even though his children died. And his fortunes, his businesses failed. And of course, if you take the short-term view, you would be taking the view of Job's wife, wouldn't you? But history has a purpose, and there are plenty of morals to be extracted. So I think I can more or less explain every turn of history, given a little time to do a bit of research. So what is the purpose of Jews? Well, the fact that they are still in existence is there to punish Gentiles for their sins. So what is the purpose of Gentiles for Jews? And of course, their purpose is to punish Jews for their sins. It's so simple and neat, isn't it? And of course, the problem is that although given the laws of God in Scripture, in the form of the Torah and the Quran, people still don't follow it properly. They cherry pick. I know it's tempting to do that. And I suppose we've all, made our own rules and broken them, and I guess been punished for them, because when I've broken my own rules, it doesn't end well for me. But then, even the fact that breaking my own rules resulted in my not, suffering some inconvenience or whatever. These irritations and inconveniences reminded me that I should follow my own rules. So there is a purpose in suffering pain, you see. So if you take the long view, I suppose you can call it the godlike view, it does begin to make sense now, doesn't it? So if you take the long view, you would see that Jews are in fact necessary to kickstart the whole idea of the oneness of God idea. So you think, well, what about the Christians? They were terrible people. They would burn each other for crazy little things that aren't even true. And then you think, well, Christians are there to be a warning from history about doing things the wrong way and making up lies and making people believe in them and forcing them to believe in them and burning them as heretics if they refused. And then you think, well, what about those poor people who died, who were burnt to death? And I suppose you have to say, well, if God exists, then he would have made it up to them. It's like, poor Michael Servetus, poor, whoever it was who died for their principles. I'll make it up to you. I'll give you extra goodies in heaven. And even if there were no heaven, even if all that happened to us after we died was that we rotted and became no more, those of us who've managed to make a name for ourselves will live on in history, like John Wycliffe, whose ideas came to my notice. I'd heard of the Lollards a long time ago, but I never looked them up until this week. So, all these people who died horrible deaths, they live on. But imagine if they died naturally and they never said anything much, and well, then we wouldn't remember them at all. So perhaps there is some purpose in dying a martyr's death. And it is this ability to think to take a historical perspective that comes from religion, really, because it is actually the interaction of the rules of different competing religions that point you to which religion we have to choose if we are going to be rational and moral about it. And of course, you know what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that secular Quranism is for everyone, including the Jews. And nobody can argue against that, because the Abrahamic narrative makes perfect sense. You really can't escape from the power and glory and the truth and logic of it. So all you're left with is post lies about me saying I'm Jewish or that I'm being paid by the Jews to say all this. Even as you know that I intend to solve the problem of anti-Semitism by placing Jews on a register, and this would stop, any person who isn't observant, any Jew who isn't observant, from claiming all the privileges of being a Jew. Such a person would just have to assimilate. And then there would be fewer Jews, and then it would be all right. People wouldn't get so triggered about them anymore. Well, that's what Muslims, they don't follow their own rules either, and that's why they're, second-class citizens in the West, tarred with a brush of terrorism and all kinds of things. So my problem is not having anyone who actually knows what I'm talking about to discuss these things. All I get is, we don't like it. We don't wanna. You can't make us. Which is what Jay would have said if he'd been allowed to come on. So, Jen, I've actually blocked her. I think she's been terribly traumatized by not having an identity that she can be proud of, and that's why she's LARPing as a Hindu. We suspect, don't we, that she is Jewish, or that her father is Jewish, and although she's not halakhically Jewish, she rejected the Catholicism of her mother. I do feel for her. I like to think that I would reject Catholicism too, once I had a think about these things. I mean, the great thing about being Chinese is that nobody demands that you do, believe anything. It's like, just show up for dinner after we do our ancestor worship thing. And that's it, you turn up, your grandmother, goes through the rituals of ancestor worship, and it's quite simple, really. You kind of, this is what she did. I don't think people do it now. Or fewer and fewer people are, but basically you have a table, you lay out all the places for all these ancestors, and you call them, and you can do it with 2 coins, heads and tail. It's got to be heads and tail to signify that they have arrived for dinner, and then you give them a decent interval, and then you throw the coins again, and to see if they've finished dinner, and then you clear things up, and then you all eat, and that's it. And I remember once asking her, it was a silly, childish question, but what would you do if the coins not, we're always saying 2 heads or 2 tails, and you can't ever clear things up, or they wouldn't arrive, and of course it's like eventually you will get the combo that you need because of the laws of probability. And of course you mustn't hurry them. You just give them a decent interval to have their dinner, and then go off. And nobody had to actually believe in it, they just had to do it. And the purpose of these rituals is to say, yeah, we are the people who do these things, and the thing we did, or the thing Grandma did, was this. So there would be this collective memory of having done this thing that you will remember and try and replicate if you have children. There will be certain stories attached to it, of course, so you won't like this, but all dead Chinese people go to hell, okay? But the layers of it, and I guess some parts of hell are better than other bits, and your status can lower after you are dead. So so the dead are divided, a bit like Jews and Gentiles, really. So your worshipped ancestor, if you have male offspring, okay, you've got male offspring to perform the rites. He'll have a wife to do all the dinner, cooking, hospitality, and then the male descendant performs the rituals. And as long as you have male descendants who do it, then you're all right. You're a worshipped ancestor. But the moment you're left with no children, or only daughters or female descendants, well, these rituals don't count. So of course this will, obviously make having male descendants more desirable than having female descendants. And that's really the, I guess, the noble lie that kept the Chinese producing large families so that they could be used as cannon fodder to extend the Chinese empire. But since the West has become gay, this is not going to happen. Not, you're going to have a labour shortage, or the people who should be doing the work won't do the work because they're only welfare claimants, and the welfare state is now your sacred cow. Things will go from bad to worse, and I guess your politicians are not going to admit this because they think, well, it doesn't look too good, but if we talk about it, it'll upset them, so we better not talk about it. And anyway, this thing will last for as long as we live anyway, and who cares about posterity? Who cares about future generations? As long as we're all right before it goes to shit, we'll have counted ourselves fortunate. So this is how they think. This is how basically people like Jay think. He doesn't really care. His concerns are completely short-term. The pleasure of getting on this channel to talk the same old shit. And what about Jen? She has created her own identity because she has rejected what she could have. Well, we know that her father wasn't religious, and her mother is Catholic, so she's only left with Catholicism, and she rejected that, and therefore she had to find something else. But then, the obvious choice would be Islam, but then, Islam is, a low status immigrant religion, and probably because of class reasons, mostly because of class reasons, she rejected that too. So she lobbed to India and found something exotic and apparently moral, and that became her identity. Which is unsustainable, of course, and I suspect deep down she knows this. I've offered to her the identity of being a secular Quranist, but she doesn't want that either. That's understandable. She would find it very difficult to admit that she was wrong. And of course, pride is a deadly sin, and she's not the only one suffering from that. Because of course the problem is really that of unacknowledged snobbery. Because you look at Islam, it's associated with the immigrants, you hate immigration, you hate immigrants, and the group of immigrants that you hate the most are Muslims. So, I understand how it would be difficult for you to think that way, but I have offered you secular Quranism, which is your opportunity to impose your own twist of the Occidental on a religion that you think is Eastern, but which comes from the same place as Judaism and Christianity anyway. So, what is a problem? Well, maybe it hasn't been put to you formally, properly, by some high status person that you respect on TV, and that's why you can't absorb the information. And obviously, if you were able to understand and absorb information without thinking, oh, it must come from the TV, it must come from, I don't know, some packaging that makes it suddenly respectable. If you were capable of independent thought, for example, you would be able to see the points I'm making, but I don't think you're capable of being honourable about these things, about truth, logic and morality. It's your herd instinct. You'll be looking around you thinking, the others hate it, so I can't like it. And if I say I like it, the others will be mean to me. So really, I am talking to cattle. I'm sure Jed thinks in the same way. So she prefers talking to unmasculine men, or men who are desperate, but beta males basically. They're easy to control. If they want sex, a bit of attention from a woman in a class above them, and she can give it to them. That's all it takes to get their loyalty and attention. She kept Gandalf going for quite a while, didn't she? But I'm not into that. You know I'm not into that. So Jay's problem is really, he's in a bind. He knows Christianity is kaput, but he thinks he's all right. The sun is shining, he can go swimming, he's got sluts to fuck. Who gives a shit about ideas? Nobody he knows does. He's damn well made sure that he only associates with people who don't give a shit about these things. And he only comes here to, piss on us, really. Just tell us that we're losers, and we're lucky to have him because he's respectable, really. But there's one last thing I wanted to talk about, which is this guy called Assad. Now he's an interesting guy. I thought his ideas were quite interesting because he's Jewish. Well, he's not actually halakhically Jewish because only his father was a Jew and his mother was a Muslim. But his father was an Austrian diplomat called Mohammed Assad. I heard one of his interviews yesterday, and it was nearly an hour, and afterwards I thought, what the fuck was he saying? And so I looked, I had an idea. It was something to do with religion and secularism and Islam and 9/11, and apparently this very dull man had gotten into trouble with the authorities, and then of course he realised, he couldn't speak clearly. He was really dull in order not to get into trouble. So he's an anthropologist, so I'm just presuming he has. He does study groups, but I'm not really sure which groups he it seems more an exercise of comparative religion. And this is what I've done, and I've said it far clearer. And I do want to be understood. I don't want to be wondered at for what the hell I could be talking about. So some other writer called William E. Connolly attempted to summarize Assad's theoretical contributions on secularism as follows. Yeah, I mean, I just sat there thinking, what the fuck? What is he talking about? So he distilled it into Connolly distilled Tala al-Assad's writings into 4 points. Number 1, secularism is not merely the division between public and private realms that allows religious diversity to flourish in the latter. It can itself be a carrier of harsh exclusions, and it secretes a new definition of religion that conceals some of its most problematic practices from itself. Now this links back to strange things that Tom Holland said. This was something Jay heard a little bit about it, and he couldn't stand what he couldn't stand what Tom Holland was, and he couldn't understand what he was saying. And basically this stream that I wanted Jay, it's like I can't get anyone of sufficient intellect to understand anything, because I'm bumping along at the bottom with morons and vegetables who will always pretend not to understand it because they either really can't or they are too scared to say they do understand. So what this stream was about, this Tom Holland stream, was he was basically talking about Christianity as if it were liberalism. And of course this is a massive category error, and I know that none of you care about category errors or even know what it is. Jay doesn't care about the meaning of words. He will use any approximation of the idea he is trying to express, and that'll be good enough for him and his mates. But what we have to understand is that secularism is our religion. How do we know that? Because its laws are enforced. The ideas of secularism are enforced and imposed on us. So if there's a competing claim of Christianity or liberalism, aka secularism, wins. So liberalism is our operating moral system, and it's no longer working. But because people are so confused, they still think we're Christian or conservative if a conservative government is in power, and they don't like to think about these things, or they can't because they haven't got the mental equipment, then they will be permanently confused and always blame the Jews, or the Muslims, or the non-whites, or whoever they don't like the look of. Anyway, it doesn't really help that Assad expresses himself in this ridiculously obscure way. We go on to the second point, which is In creating its characteristic division between secular public space and religious private space, European secularism sought to shuffle ritual and discipline into the private realm. In doing so, however, it loses touch with the ways in which embodied practices of conduct help to constitute culture, including European culture. Why the fuck do they write like that? I actually have to examine it phrase by phrase. So, when was religion divided between secular public space and religious private space? There is no division. It's basically, okay, they're talking about multiculturalism, right? So they're saying, well, however you believe, whether you believe in God or not, or how you believe in God, we don't care. We're not going to persecute you. Okay, which is fair enough. But really, the most important part that secularism ignores is that the laws have to be right for all. It's got to be a one-size-fits-all law. And I'm saying it's the no-hide laws, which nobody wants to talk about, Jew or Gentile. The Muslims don't want to talk about it because they reject the idea of the no-hide laws too, because they hate Jews. So there's a mention of culture, European culture, in the second point. And really, culture is... What is culture? This isn't defined. I can define it for you. And culture is basically practice. And practice that is allowed by the law and the moral system operating. So, the culture of the West is sexual permissiveness, extramarital sex. That is the culture that we have. I mean, but then there'll be all kinds of idiots saying, "Oh no, it's high art. It's Beethoven. It's opera." No, we're talking about culture as in what people do, what most people do, and the culture is sexual promiscuity of sex and drugs and rock and roll. That's your culture. And you see Muslims as threatening it, and you see Jews as people clever enough to support liberalism and democracy in public and really kowtow to you, but in private they make sure that they marry before they have children, and they stay together for the sake of the children, and practice their religion, which reinforces their identity, such as keeping the Sabbath and celebrating their religious festivals, which gives them a sense of their identity, while Gentiles just get drunk in December, get presents, spend a lot of money that they don't have, giving it to people who aren't grateful. Then they stuff themselves with turkey on Christmas Day. So that's their culture. Oh yeah, and eat chocolate eggs at Easter. That's their culture. it's not surprising then that Jews and Muslims would race ahead in this environment of degeneracy. 3. The constitution of modern Europe as a continent and secular civilization makes it incumbent to treat Muslims in its midst on the one hand as abstract citizens and on the other hand as a distinctive minority, either to be tolerated or restricted depending on the politics of the day. Yeah, so it's time we have that debate about, whether we live in a matriarchy, whether Christianity is kaput, whether the patriarchy should be restored, and no one I know is prepared to have that conversation in an honest and rational way. Not even people who you would expect to care about their racial hygiene. As you all know, JF is... He's not married to this woman that everybody says is mentally deficient, is he? Four, European modern secular constitutions of Islam in cumulative effect converge upon a series of simple contrasts between themselves and Islamic practices. These terms of contrast falsify the deep grammar of European secularism and contribute to the culture wars some bearers of these very definitions seek to ameliorate. Oh, bloody hell. I mean, why do these fuckers write like that? It's because they don't want to be understood. That's why these fuckers write like that. I mean, listen to this again. European modern secular constitutions of Islam in cumulative effect converge upon a series of simple contrasts between themselves and Islamic practices. Fuck that shit. I don't know what it means. These terms of contrast falsify the deep grammar of European secularism and contribute to the culture wars some bearers of these very definitions seek to ameliorate. Well, fuck that shit. I can't explain nonsense to you. Fuck that shit, William E. Connolly. Who the fuck are you? William Eugene Connolly is a political theorist known for his work on democracy, pluralism, capitalism, and climate change. Okay, we got you. William Connolly. You weren't trying to explain anything at all. You were trying to obscure it. As if Assad himself were not already obscure enough. But there are a series of short paragraphs that I can try and explain as I read it out to you. So, Talal Assad wrote a book called Formations of the Secular, Christianity, Islam and Modernity. So, he wrote some essays. And he questions the Western notion of secularism. And then he talks about 9/11, and that gets controversial, and that's how he got into trouble. And then, predictably, as a Muslim and a Jew, he complained about explosions of intolerance. that seemed to him entirely compatible with secularism in a highly modern society. However, rather than simply letting such a coincidence pass, Assad continues by stating that such behaviours are intertwined with secularism in modern society. This leads Assad's deployment of the genealogical method in order to understand why a country like the United States denominates itself as secular despite the distinctly religious Manichaean tones of good and evil often found within the historical record of the United States. He further notes that despite the nominally secular character of the United States, repressive measures have been directed at real and imagined secular opponents. Okay. Is there a religious view about terrorism? This is the view I take of war and terrorism. None of the Abrahamic faiths condemns war. I don't think any world religion says we must never fight wars. Islam does say that only defensive wars are legitimate, but then it also says jizya is to be extracted from conquered peoples, and just putting it in that way. So it's is a way of sanctioning imperialistic wars. So it's saying, well, obviously, if you can spread Islam in this way, by all means do so, and they did in the Middle East. So I don't find that particularly shocking. Not really, because before we had the Abrahamic faith, people did fight. Tribes would fight each other. There would be tribal wars, and obviously the different tribes would worship different gods. I'm trying to think of the Greeks. It doesn't really stop me fighting wars. The Romans had a civil war. They all worshipped the same Roman gods. The Greeks. Okay, the war between Athens and Sparta, I think they all worshipped the same gods, didn't they? So all a religion can do is talk about, to try and ameliorate the consequences of war is to lay down some ground rules about what you can and can't do in war. And this, the Quran does. The New Testament doesn't do it. So that's another reason why the Quran is better. But too bad I don't have anyone capable of discussing things like that with me. So okay. If you agree with me that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, then you're not going to be able to say, well, all terrorism is wrong and all war is right. That would be far too simplistic, right? So we already know that the late Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for terrorist charges. So what does that mean? It's like, history will tell, whether it was a just war or not. The fact that you won doesn't mean the war was just. All the consequences have yet to come and be analysed. So, was the British Empire a good thing? Bit of a curate's egg. Did the loss of the British Empire mean, how was it for the rest of the world? If you didn't like the British, perhaps you thought the Americans would be better. Are the Americans better? Do even Americans approve of neoconservatism, which is American imperialism by another name? Have the Americans overextended themselves? Are the Americans themselves falling into a Thucydides trap? These are things I wish I had somebody to talk to about. Okay, the thesis of the book is as follows. The secular, I argue, is neither continuous with the religious that supposedly preceded it. That is, it is not the latest phase of a sacred origin, nor a simple break from it. That is not the opposite, an essence that excludes a sacred. What the fuck? I take the secular to be a concept that brings together certain behaviours, knowledges, and sensibilities in modern life. Building on that notion, Assad is also critical of the more common concept of secularism, which he views as having no distinct features that demarcate it from prior forms of secularism found elsewhere in the world. Instead, he favours another approach to viewing modern secularism. In my view, the secular is neither singular in origin nor stable in its historical identity, although it works through a series of particular oppositions. What the fuck? With that said, Assad's goal for the book is to understand how a more general pre-secularism mutates into the more familiar novel form of secularism present within the Euro-American societies. Assad makes clear his interest in this specific novel variant. So, this is a man who calls himself an anthropologist, and he dares to express himself in this shit way, so nobody knows what the hell he's talking about. If he wants to question secularism, why the fuck doesn't he? And if he's only questioning it in this half-arsed way, why did he even bother? Fucking shit. Is he dead now? Nope, still alive. Born 1932. Talking this shit. He didn't mention the no-hide laws. He's a Jew, but he didn't mention the no-hide laws. So you have all these academics who could say what I say more elegantly and more eloquently, but no, they want to obscure the truth. So Talal Assad is some sort of kuffar, talking shit, getting away with it because of his papa. Fucking shit. Waste of time. You know, some people are just not, some sons are just not up to filling their father's boots, are they? At least his papa did stuff. Muhammad Assad, what did he do? Well, actually, it was Jen who brought him to my attention. His father was one Leopold Weiss. And he converted to Islam and married. Well, he was a much married man. I think he may have 3 wives. Or was it 4? I don't know. He was a diplomat. Began as a journalist and he became a diplomat. He was invited by Muslims to write their constitution for them, Muslims in Pakistan. He didn't. I think he kind of knew it was more trouble than it's worth. If anything went wrong, he'd probably be blamed for it. So he was invited by General Zia. Into Pakistan. But, why were the Pakistanis asking him to do it anyway? Okay, I could have told them, just make sure that no judgment, no law infringes on Quranic principles, and there you have it. Why do you need him to tell you stuff to do? Okay, so one of the things that this Leopold Weiss, or Muhammad Assad, who is the father of Talal Assad, insisted on that Muslim women should have exactly the same rights in the political sphere as men, to the extent of becoming prime minister. They allowed this. So apparently that was a problem. So this article came from the one I'm about to look at. It comes from the Tablet magazine, a Jewish publication. So it begins in 1961. The eminent Muslim scholar Muhammad Assad, then living in Europe, published The Principles of State and Government in Islam. The central question posed in that book is whether Islam is opposed to the mixing of religion and politics as is the modern West. Though Assad's answer to this question are subtle and non-categorical, his overall conclusion is that in majority Muslim states, a mixture of politics and religion is necessary. Society must bind itself to the will of God, Assad stated, and the organization of an Islamic state or states is an indispensable condition of Islamic life in the true sense of the word. This was not the first time that Assad, who had been publishing books and articles since the mid-1930s, called for the infusion of religion into politics. In his highly influential 1934 essay, Islam at the Crossroads, Assad articulated a set of principles about the relationship between the Muslim world and the West that served as a basis of his later conversations with Muhammad Iqbal and other Islamist activists. He envisioned, in Pakistan and elsewhere, the emergence of Muslim states, thoroughly modern but inspired and informed by religious principles. Assad's vision of an Islamic State bears little resemblance to the militant anti-Western version propagated by ISIS today. He conceived of an Islamic State based on modern interpretations of the Quran and Islamic legal traditions, a state grounded in democratic principles, fuck democracy, where women should be treated as equals and the civil rights of non-Muslims respected. Yes, I agree with that. But I don't agree with democracy, because that's clearly fucked in the head. Perhaps that's not surprising given Assad's roots. He was born at the turn of the 20th century in Austria-Hungary, in what is now Ukraine, as Leopold Weiss. His grandparents were Orthodox Jews. His paternal grandfather was a rabbi. Weiss's parents were secularized and assimilated to European culture. His father was a successful lawyer in Vienna. As a child, Weiss had a basic Jewish education and a working knowledge of Hebrew. Educated at German universities and imbued with liberal values, he lived in the bohemian quarters of the Weimar Republic at the height of its cultural awakening and became a journalist, covering the Middle East after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. A visit to relatives in Jerusalem and a subsequent long sojourn in Arabia caused him to fall in love with the Arabs. Increasingly disillusioned with the West and rejecting the Marxism adopted by many of his European contemporaries as purely materialist, Weiss converted to Islam in 1926. He expressed his new identity with the name Muhammad Assad. Assad, meaning lion, was the equivalent of both his Hebrew name Aryeh and his Latin-derived name Leopold. I first learned of Assad in 1978. Now, who's the writer of this? Somebody called Shalom Goldman. I first learned of Assad in 1978 when I spent a term at the University of Tunis as a graduate student in Arabic language and Islamic culture. I had been searching for an accessible English translation of the Quran when one of my teachers mentioned the message of the Quran, the long-awaited interpretation by the renowned scholar Muhammad Assad would soon be published. Turning to me, the only person in the class with a recognizably Jewish name, my Tunisian professor noted that the translator was a Jew who had converted to Islam and become one of the great authorities on Islam's holy book. Intrigued by this unlikely story, I researched Assad's life and discovered that for the past 13 years he'd been in Tangiers, through an American friend living in Tangiers. I sent Assad a note requesting an interview. Assad didn't respond to me directly, but he told our mutual acquaintance, Shalom Goldman sounds like a rabbi. Tell Goldman that I have no intention of returning to Judaism. I had no intention of bringing Assad back to Judaism, but could find no way to convince him of that. In 1978, over half a century after his 1926 conversion, he remained wary of Jewish interlocutors who might challenge him on religious grounds, especially if he suspected those interlocutors had ties to Israel. But he never lost completely his connections to Europe and to his family. He tried unsuccessfully to help his parents and sister escape the Nazis, and he remained in touch with relatives who emerged to Palestine in 1939. Relatives who emigrated to Palestine in 1939, even as Assad became one of the chief architects of modern political Islam and a leading antagonist of the Jewish state. Assad counted among his friends European artists and intellectuals as well as two of the century's most renowned Islamists, Muhammad Iqbal and Abu Ala Maududi. Yet for decades decades, Assad's reputation as a political thinker was overshadowed by his monumental contribution to the field of Quranic scholarship. His 1980 English translation, The Message of the Quran, is considered the authoritative translation by many scholars within the Islamic world. In it, Assad comments frequently on politics and government, and his conclusions in the commentary are quite consistent with his earlier, overtly political writings. Assad began his travels in Egypt and then went to Palestine, where he visited relatives who had extended an invitation. These relatives were two maternal uncles, both of whom were prominent physicians. One was a psychoanalyst, the first to practice that profession in Palestine. The other was an ophthalmologist. I can't say it. Though through them, Weiss met and interviewed the Zionist leadership of the time. To these leaders, Chaim Weizmann and Arthur Rupin among them, Weiss posed sharp and critical questions about Zionist intentions concerning the Arabs of Palestine. Some years later, he wrote that I conceived from the outset a strong objection to Zionism. I considered it immoral that immigrants, assisted by a foreign great power, should come from abroad with the avowed intention of attaining to majority in the country and thus dispossess the people whose country it has been since time immemorial. Weiss visited kibbutzim and urban communities, but it seems that nothing in Zionist activity appealed to him. Quite the contrary, Zionism and its followers repelled him, and his articles to that effect in the German and Austrian press further distanced him from his Jewish co-religionists in general and from his family in particular. In Jerusalem, Weiss found an anti-Zionist ally in Jacob Israel Dahan, the journalist and activist who was the bane of the Zionist movement. Only a few months after his meetings with Weiss and other vocal and influential opponents of the new Yishuv, Dahan was assassinated in the first political murder within the Jewish community of Palestine. Assad's conversion to Islam in 1926 was linked to his rejection of Zionism. He saw Zionism as tribal and linked to colonialism. In his later writings, Zionism is depicted as an aspect of the chosen people concept, a concept Assad often mentions with derision in his Quran commentary. For Assad, Islam is universalist and Judaism is particularistic. Soon after his conversion, Assad went to Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. He was accompanied by his European wife Elsa and a son by her first marriage. In Saudi Arabia, Assad, using his journalistic connections and skills and the prestige he accrued as a European convert to Islam, became a confidant of King Abdulaziz. During his 6 years in the kingdom, Assad served as advisor to the Saudi royal court. But the relationship turned sour when Assad criticised corrupt Saudi officials and suggested that the government adopt a more pious and less extravagant modes of behaviour. As to the connections between Wahhabi teachings and Saudi loyalty, Assad made this observation, one that embodies his critical approach to religion and government. The history of the Wahhabis is the story of a religious idea which rose on the wings of enthusiasm and longing, and then sank down into the lowlands of Pharisaic self-righteousness. For all virtue destroys itself as soon as it ceases to be longing and humility. After 6 years in Saudi Arabia, Assad travelled to India, where in 1932 he met the philosopher and poet Muhammad Iqbal, who encouraged a young convert to stay and help, in Assad's phrasing, to elucidate the intellectual premises of the future Islamic State, and in tandem with this to serve as a scholarly bridge between South Asian Islam and the English-speaking West. It was in India at Iqbal's urging that Assad wrote Islam at the Crossroads, the 1934 essay addressed to fellow Muslims. In that essay, Assad described his journey to Islam. He made no mention of his Jewish background or of his radical rejection of Zionism. He told his readers almost nothing about his own past other than that he, unlike his readers, had had to discover Islam, and since his conversion he had endeavoured, he wrote, to learn as much as I could about Islam. I studied the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. I studied the language of Islam and its history, and a good deal of what has been written about and against it. I spent over 5 years in Arabia, mostly in Medina, so that I might experience something of the original surroundings in which this religion was preached by the Arabian prophet. Those studies and comparisons created in me the firm conviction that Islam, as a spiritual and social phenomenon, is still, in spite of the drawbacks caused by the deficiencies of the Muslims, by far the greatest driving force mankind has ever experienced, and all my interest became, since then, centered around the problem of its regeneration. The phrase, in spite of all the drawbacks caused by the deficiencies of Muslims, is worth noting. Yes, Assad implies, there are numerous problems in Muslim-majority countries, but these problems are not the result of living according to Islam. Rather, they are the result of the failure of Muslims to live up to the standards of their own tradition. Islam at the Crossroads, published in English, was soon translated into Urdu and later into Arabic. It had enormous influence in both languages and is still on sale throughout the Muslim world. At the beginning of World War II, Assad, who had an Austrian passport and was suspected of anti-British agitation, was imprisoned by the British in Lahore. He was suspended the duration of the war in a prison camp where he worked on scholarly projects, primarily English translations of classic Islamic texts. In the British detention camp, Assad was soon joined by his Saudi-born wife Munira and their son Talal Assad, now a renowned anthropologist who teaches at CUNY. He was able to receive mail from family members and learned that his father and sister, stuck in Vienna, were unable to escape the Nazis. In a memoir published in the 1980s, Assad wrote, "My father disappeared in Theresienstadt. After the Anschluss, I had supplied him with a visa to the Punjab, but he did not want to flee without his daughter. When I also sent my sister a visa, she lost a letter. She died in Auschwitz." Other than in this terse statement and others like it, Assad did not, as far as I can ascertain, address the fate of European Jews. In his voluminous correspondence and published writings, there is little mention of the fate of his family and of the Jewish world from which he had sprung. A few years after Assad's death, his son, Talal Assad, told of his father's grief on learning of the fate of his father and sister. "My father was an intellectual type, not particularly emotional. The only time in my life that I remember seeing him actually cry was when he was informed at the end of the war that his father and his sister had perished in the death camps. This was the only time he asked me not to join him on his evening stroll, the only time he wanted to be alone." With the 1947 partition of India, Assad and his family became citizens of Pakistan, and Assad became a confidant and advisor to the founders of the new state. At the request of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the political founder of Pakistan, Assad compiled a document on suggestions for an Islamic constitution for an Islamic state. Soon after independence was declared, Jinnah established the DIR, the Department of Islamic Reconstruction, with Assad at its head. Among the DIR's tasks, to draft Pakistan's constitution and to propose the frameworks of the new state's educational and social systems, all along Islamic lines. Assad drew up the documents describing these plans and circulated them among Pakistan's religious scholars. His project was, in Assad's words, an attempt to establish an Islamic state as a liberal, multi-party parliamentary democracy. Well, that's already wrong, isn't it? Liberal, multi-party parliamentary democracy. He found evidence for these principles in the Quran and in later Islamic sources of which he was an acknowledged master. Most significant among Assad's ideas about the Pakistani constitution was his proposal for a Supreme Court. Assad's proposal provided a means whereby disputes regarding the Sharia provision in specific cases might be resolved. In an article in the journal Arafat, titled Islamic Constitution Making, Assad proposed that a supreme tribunal be empowered to adjudicate disagreements between the head of state and the executive council. But many in the political and religious elites opposed this idea as it displayed too direct an influence of Western ideas. I don't quite get this, really. I guess it means disagreements between the Prime Minister and his cabinet, or the equivalent. To continue, also controversial was Assad's proposal that the political rights of non-Muslims be enshrined in the constitution, though he agreed with the more conservative members of the ulama that the head of government should be a Muslim. Also, Assad advocated for women's participation in the political process. In its 1992 obituary of Assad, the British newspaper, The Independent, noted that he was a powerful advocate of the rights of women. It was Assad's insistence that the constitution of Pakistan allow for the election of a woman leader that opened the way for Benazir Bhutto. But none of Assad's suggestions were implemented. Muhammad Ali Jinnah died of tuberculosis within a year of the establishment of Pakistan, and the issue of the new state's constitution was put off indefinitely. After Jinnah, the new government terminated the Department of Islamic Reconstruction, and Assad was transferred to the Foreign Ministry. There, in the early 1950s, he served as head of the Pakistani delegation to the United Nations. It was during those years in New York City that Assad re-established connections with some of his Jewish relatives, including relatives who lived in Israel. It was in New York that he wrote The Road to Mecca, an autobiography published by Simon & Schuster in 1954 and very positively reviewed in the leading journals and newspapers of the day. The New York Times reviewer called it an intensely interesting and moving book. Disillusioned with the Pakistani politics, he then made the transition to the world of Islamic scholarship, moved to Europe, and between 1964 and 1980 produced what many today deem the finest translation of the Quran into English, accompanied by an extensive scholarly commentary. But though he retreated into a life of scholarly endeavour, Assad continued to write about the relationship between religion and politics, and it was through these writings and through his commentary on the Quran that he exerted wide influence. In his 1961 book, The Principles of State and Government in Islam, he argued for an Islamic form of government, but he warned fellow Muslims against accepting the claims of those who wanted to return to the norms and forms of the distant past. These thinkers he dubbed reactionaries, who claimed that the only authentic Islamic polity was one that seeks to slavishly imitate the era of the Prophet and the early Caliphate. These actors, according to Assad, sought to distort the concept of jihad and make it an instrument of empire. It is really the jizya that is the instrument of empire. Assad wrote, by representing the idea of jihad in clear contradiction to all Quranic injunctions as an instrument of aggression as an instrument of aggressive expansion of Muslim rule over non-Muslim territories, they sow fear in the hearts of non-Muslims and fill many righteous Muslims with disgust at the thought of the injustice which such a tendency so obviously implies. And finally, by claiming, again without any warrant in Quran or Sunnah, that the Sharia imposes on us a duty to discriminate in all social aspects of life between the Muslim and non-Muslim minorities. They make it impossible for the minorities to bear with equanimity the thought that the country in which they live might become an Islamic state. Assad did not think that Sharia should be applied with uniformity throughout the Muslim world. One may safely say there is not only one form of the Islamic State, but many, and it is for the Muslims of every period to discover the forms most suitable to their needs. Of course, he is quite right. Sharia, according to Assad, cannot provide detailed legislation for every contingency of life. Consequently, the lawgiver meant us Muslims to provide for the necessary additional legislation of our ijtihad, independent reasoning, in consonance with the spirit of Islam. In the Message of the Quran, published in sections between 1964 and 1980, he returned to the political and religious ideas that he articulated and espoused in the 1930s and 40s. One example stands out. In his commentary on Surat Al-Imran 3:159, and take counsel with them in all matters of public concern, then, when thou hast decided on a course of action, place their trust in God. For verily God loves those who place their trust in him. Assad writes, this injunction implying government by consent and counsel must be regarded as one of the fundamental clauses of all Quranic legislation relating to statecraft. So I do quote chapter 3 verse 159 quite often because it is the Shura verse, the verse requiring consultation. Particularly disturbing to Assad was the takfiri idea, the tendency to brand Muslim political antagonists as infidels. In the 1980s and early 90s, Assad had the opportunity to observe the emergence of takfiri politics on the world stage, a development he found deeply disturbing. Yet though he calls for tolerance of the lesser monotheisms, meaning Christians, of course, he never misses an opportunity to point out the ways in which the Quran is correcting the mistakes of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Christianity is taken to task for distorting the actual history of Jesus, and Judaism is blamed for promulgating teachings that don't embrace all of humanity. In Assad's thought, Judaism and Zionism were inextricably joined. Of course it is. In contrast to his lifelong advocacy of the establishment of Islamic states, Assad rejected the concept of the Jewish state soon after his extended encounter with it in the mid-1920s, and his views on Zionism never changed. He viewed Zionism as a form of colonialism, and after the Israeli conquest of Jerusalem in 1967, Assad described Israeli policies that he described as limiting Muslim access to the city's holy places. In interviews late in life, including one shortly before his death in 1992, he returned often to this topic. In 2011, 2 decades after Assad's death, his son spoke at a conference in Saudi Arabia dedicated to Assad's legacy. Seeking to distance his father from present-day claims about what constitutes a true Islamic state, he claimed his father was not a political thinker, but rather a religious thinker for whom the Quran and Sunnah together formed what he called the most perfect plan for human living. Of course his father was a political thinker. What utter rubbish! It was in this connection that he wrote on the idea of the Islamic State and prepared suggestions for an Islamic constitution in Pakistan in the early years of its existence. He believed that reasoned discourse was central to the way Muslims should treat disagreements between themselves. He did not attempt to establish a movement, but sought influence through that same reasoned discourse that he called on others to employ. And in the following year, 2012, Assad's widow, Paula Hamida, his third wife, assisted by the Pakistani scholar M. Ikram Chagatai, published Homecoming of the Heart, a compilation of previously unpublished writing by and about Assad. Within that volume is Hamida's memoir of the mid-1950s, a period in which Assad left the Pakistani UN delegation and wrote his best-selling book, The Road to Mecca. Hamida notes that Assad's political adversaries among the Pakistani elites spread the rumour that Assad, living in New York City, had abandoned Islam and reverted to Judaism. To clear his name of this accusation, Assad wrote detailed and lengthy letters to Pakistani newspapers, where the controversy about him raged for a few months in 1954. Subsequently, Assad was exonerated of this charge of apostasy and his good name restored. When I read of this episode, I was able to make better sense of Assad's reply to my 1978 greeting to him, a reply in which he said, "Tell Goldman I have no intention of returning to Judaism." Today, Assad has many followers and readers, particularly among the 200 million Muslim citizens of India. One can see and hear them being interviewed in George Mishra's 2008 riveting documentary film, The Road to Mecca, The Journey of Muhammad Assad. For these followers, Assad's opinions and recommendations are as relevant as ever. Okay, so that's ended. Well, it was helpful to me, even though you're all bored silly and there's nobody watching it now. I can deal with the chat now. But I thought it was interesting that all this stuff, Israel and American foreign policy, it's all about religion, so to even think for a moment you can ignore it is crazy. No, I don't want to be Jewish. Saigon Green. There's no need for me to be Jewish. I don't want to live in Israel. I'd like to visit it though. Oh, I'm surprised Dr. Mengele supports Assad. Okay, I'll try to sum up what I think I've said, since there are no intelligent comments in the chat at all. Very disappointing, very disappointing. So I'm afraid, all this stuff about white identity is, you won't get your identity back. Okay, everybody has an identity, all right. It's like you can have a respectable identity or a disreputable one. You can have the identity of a lunatic, a wino, a tramp, a vagabond, or you can have the identity of a respectable pillar of the community. So you have to work at it, whatever it is you want. And since you no longer have any guidance, I'm afraid it's going to be hard. And since you reject any possibility of guidance by saying your identity of hating Jews and Muslims is enough to get you by, and of course your hatred of your politicians, and what principles have your politicians? They don't have any principles, and that is again a problem because they can only think in the short term. They are not really even thinking of governing in the national interest. So they'll just continue to run everything down in order and only do so for short-term gain. And this is why, why I think everything should change. And this is why I wish I could have somebody of some intellectual and moral respectability. But I can't, bumping along at the bottom. And that is my tragedy and yours.